Time for the con presentation.
Yeah, could you go to the beginning of my presentation, please? Thank you. All right, I want to pay attention to what this debate is about. Don't allow you to be distracted by this elegant silver mane, yet about to dance with President Trump in the White House in a few minutes. Because genomic information is complex. The other stuff may not be as correct. So the key points I'm going to make, I'm not going to hide them, is it's the underappreciated durability and persistence of the fleeting present. There are patients we're going to be treating today and that are going to suffer if we do the wrong thing. And the present is a lot longer than we'd like to believe. I want to also remind you that the essential first rule of clinical care, and this is about clinical care, not research, is primum non nocere. Not, by the way, appropriately attributed to Hippocrates, but it's actually much more recent. It's Sydenham of Sydenham's Korea, who was actually the originator of that term. But first do no harm. When we go to a doctor, it's really annoying if the first thing they do to us is to harm us. We have quite the opposite ambition. Unfortunately, genetic reductionism is a very useful distraction that many of us tend to play into from what really ails us. It actually distracts us from the real problem. And most common diseases are mostly not genetic. And a reminder, the family history, which you seem to claim for the pro side, is not the result of the Human Genome Project. It's not a genetic test even, and it's grossly underused. And here's some of the harm. Top-notch studies have identified genetic variants associated with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a 1 in 500 disease, causes our athletes and others to drop dead on the court. And this 1 in 500 disease, I asked my then student, Rajman Rai, to look into the data, and sure enough, he found that there was not 1 in 500, but maybe 2% incidence of the mutations that are textbook for this 1 in 500 disease, autosomal dominant. And I said, could you please look into what the ethnicity of these individuals are? And basically, they were African American. And even in our own clinic, arguably the best clinic in the world for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we diagnosed over the years many African Americans with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And guess what? When you're diagnosed with an autosomal dominant disease, not only do we scare the hell out of you, not only do we start talking about putting implantable defibrillators into you, but we do it to your entire family. That is not theoretical harm, that is real harm. And guess what? That was at our best lab. I can tell you many clinical labs around the world still list these variants, which are, by the way, just common variants, non-pathogenic in African Americans because of errors made in the original studies. Again, I'm very optimistic about the future, but the present, that durable present, is causing hundreds of people to be damaged and hurt. And Raj published this a couple years ago in the New England Journal, if you're interested. Also, fantastic technology. We can measure cell-free genetic panels and prognosticate what is the right treatment for cancer. Sounds worth, I've had family members with cancer. I would pay anything for a great panel. And in fact, the cost of these is $5,000 or $6,000. This study in JAMA Oncology, among others, shows that concordance in this test is 50%. 50%. Half of the time, it shows the exact opposite than the other. And this is on the variants that are shared. This is what we're paying $7,000 for. This is what we're telling patients that they should tell their doctors to pay for, to get them to bill for, because it's going to help them. That's what we are telling our patients. How would you feel if I told you your doctor had a 50% chance of disagreeing with the other doctor about radically different approach to therapy? But that's what we're giving because of Dr. Pangloss. Family history. It's really important. These very important, thoughtful people said we should reconsider family history, which required no more genetics. But they said we could really do a lot better if we consider family history. Yet, oh, by the way, and then later, there was an NIH panel that said, shouldn't we do family history? Sounds great. How many hundreds of millions of dollars would have that saved if we just did family history? And then there's studies showing, well, even with a little bit of genetics, if you had a lot of family history, you'd do a lot better. This paper shows we don't use it. So the answer is, let's do more genetics because we're not going to use it more. I mean, what's going on here? And I remember being at Geisinger early on in emergency years, 10 years ago, and I told them, well, what about the electronic health record and the genetics? And I was told that Geisinger, Epic told us it'll be there in family history and genetics in 2 or 3 years. Job well done, mission accomplished. All right, yeah. And so now we have obesity. We just heard a lot about obesity. And look at this, it's huge, it's growing. And there can be only one conclusion that you can take from this huge pandemic of obesity. Mutations. There is now, this is, for those who don't know, this is from the X-Men, the Blob. Politically incorrect, but it's not mine, it's the Blob. It's one of the legit X-Men. Clearly, what we have, because of this, we can only explain this huge epidemic because of we've all become a nation of fat X people, right? Well, some people who we just heard from would say, well, maybe that is true because we have a PRS score. But let's look at the PRS score. If you actually look at the PRS score and see across all the, by the way, this is work done by Venkatesh Murthy at Ann Arbor, Michigan. If you look at the BMI versus the PRS score, there is signal there on the left, not much. Here's against non-genetic causes. And speaking as a pediatric endocrinologist, I can tell you, by age 3, I can tell you better than any of the PRS scores which kid's going to be fat. Because by age 3, they've declared themselves. What is the real cause of this? It's not genetics. You see that nice rise in likes for Coca-Cola? That's just part of a long campaign of Coca-Cola since 1886. Do you know how much Coca-Cola Corporation alone spends on marketing its juicy, calorific wares to us every year? Anybody want to take a guess? Guess. No, 3.6 billion. 3.6 billion. And the total, just the 3 top sellers of eat more carbs with your carb drinks, their budgets is only $7 billion a year. That's a fair amount of research. That's real impact. They actually got the job done. And they weren't messing with genetics. They were messing with our heads because that's where it had to happen. And along the lines of following after the leading study that we heard from New York, we did something a little bit easier because we had a 45 million patient claims database. And the claims databases are fun because you can escape your hospital in the United States, but you can't escape your bills. And so we could figure out what the heritability is on multiple studies, and we found, in fact, that heritability for most things is way low. So if you're asking yourself, where are we going to actually be clinically, not scientifically, clinically impactful? Genetics would not seem to be the place. So what to do? First, let's continue and scale up pan-ethnic, just like Terry said, pan-ethnic germline sequencing linked to longitudinal health trajectories. That is absolutely essential. And if we do that, eventually, Pangloss will be right. We need a consumer reports equivalent for genomics so that we can tell which of those two non-cell assays is actually giving us information.
Time's up. Has been up.
Scale up the environmental assessment. We need a human environmental project to match our Human Genome Project. And we need multi-pronged social engineering for public health, cigarette style for modifiable risk. And we have to fix medical education and automated workflow around genetics and family history. Thank you very much.
Please leave that up. Thank you. All right, I get a 7-minute thing. I want to first start with my favorite cokehead from Cambridge Analytica, and the wonderful thing that he talked about there is, you know, he's really part of the nagging nabobs of negativity and wanting to slow things down. I may be having to work with the White House. Well, I have my time here. I may have to deal with the White House for a pediatric initiative for a good purpose, but I do know, Zach, from what you said, what I was understanding you would resonate to build a wall around genetics and have Mexico pay for it, right? So stop everything, wait a period of time, build the wall, and of course we'll get Mexico to pay for it. We may get Australia as well, but I think those will be hard sells to be able to do this. And now, calling me a poopy head was really interesting because there is something up to that. We all have a lot of poop. We have a tremendous amount. And the microbiome looks to be a very interesting modifier of disease per se. So I find that to be not an insult, but rather a compliment to call me a poopy head, okay? So I'm not the least bit offended by that. The other thing is, you know, this notion of Leibniz and Pangloss having problems. Well, Leibniz did something for calculus and mathematics that we still use for all the analyses, including the undiagnosed network, the one genetic thing that you seem to have singled out. But what happened to Lamarck? He was somebody who was thinking around that same time in France as Voltaire, and I imagine you probably would have worshipped the notions of Lamarck. So just sort of getting those personal things off the chest, so to speak, let's come back to some of the things that were said up here. Continue and scale up pan-ethnic germline sequencing. That sounds great. I think we're all for that. But again, how high is your wall going to be in order to wait for all that information? Are we going to wait 10 to 15 years before we can start to use genetic information that we have at our fingertips right now? Scaling up the environmental assessment. We all agree we need to understand more about those relationships between environment and our genes. But genes are not deterministic. They're interacting with your environment. And I think what we are starting to see with PRSs and some of the panel testing is how and in what way you use these in different clinical settings. Fixing medical education, that's a great idea. I think that goes up with the first one. I fully agree with that. But again, I'm not going to wait for 3 generations of doctors to start talking about PRSs, okay? I think that the time is at hand, and I think the education of not only the doctors, but of the general public as well. And so this is where I think this sort of Harvard idea in the ivory tower, we're going to do genetics and we have to wait till we've done it right and then have the blessing of the Broad and Harvard Medical School before anyone else can start to work with it, is a real problematic approach, okay? And I think that we are a democratic society. Yes, you are in a blue state, but there are lots of other blue states and there are lots of red states that also embrace genetics. So why can't Vanderbilt be at the vanguard of that? They're in a red state as well. So I think we have to be a little more sanguine and think that, you know, this is a liberating principle, genetics. It is not a restricting principle. The idea of not doing harm, I fully agree, but not doing harm has two components to it. If you look in the legal system, there is, as Benjamin Cardozo said, there are times of omission are just as bad. You look back in the 20s and 30s when Cardozo and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. were each making very important decisions about health and about environment, about the Baker's cases, that it was just as bad not to act when you knew what you could do to improve the situation of workers and their health as to do something that would be bad. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't build too high a wall and ask Mexico for too much money. Otherwise, I think we are going to fail miserably in that. So when we think about family history, it is a wonderful proxy. No, it was not born by the Human Genome Project. Family history goes back, I gave an example in 1860 when a brilliant neurobiologist, a neuroscientist noticed something in the family of his wife and was able to see that there were these really crucial relationships and talked about that. And that's something that is part of the discovery. Now the question is, do we act upon that right away? No. I think, as I showed in one of my first slides, the arc of genetics goes from discovery to a validation to a clinical implementation. And we are already seeing some of these things getting ready, and if not, going into the clinical implementation because they have been validated. They're not evil things. They're not sticking things into people saying, oh, we're going to CRISPR your genes. Now, I could make a few suggestions that you could be CRISPRed for that may help with your political and old-fashioned views towards genetics, Zach, but I think we have to recognize that Pandora has opened that box, and the notion of clinical testing is upon us. And the question is, how do we better do it? The one study you showed about the 50% overlap, some of that has to do with some of the bioinformatics and some of the computational questionable practices. And I think this is where industry and academics are really clashing, and we have to look at how we're going to solve those questions. But I think it's the academics who are really crucial for that, not necessarily, the Trump-laden, commercial setting that, take away all the restrictions and let whatever you want to have happen in the commercial sector. So the American people are not going to put up with that. They're too wise for that kind of recidivism, I think, at this point. So I'm going to stop a couple seconds early and let him come back up, and that's when the free-for-all starts. Now, Howard, do you have your black and white sweatshirt with the whistle so that when we're both at the podium, you can keep us apart or keep us together?
You bet. First thing I want to do is please join me in thanking the two debaters.
But we still